Hi and welcome to Steve Wraith's True Crime Podcast. And today I'm proud to be joined by Richard Jones, who is a Jack the Ripper expert. He has written many books and produced many books on the subject, including Jack the Ripper, the Case Scrapbook. We've also got this one, the Jack the Ripper's London book, and we've got the latest book, which is called Jack the Ripper's East End, which is Edgar's Walking Guide. They're all available on Amazon. You can buy them on there. And if you want to find out more, you can also jump on a website called jacktheripper.org. Richard's on there. He's the site author. Some interesting facts on there if it's a subject that you've never actually explored. Richard, welcome to the show. I'm looking for you to educate me on Jack the Ripper. Jamie Boyle put you in my direction. I know he's got a fascination. Mine, I think, as I told you off air, is about the Cray twins. They're from the same neck of the woods.
Same neck of the woods. In fact, in some cases, even the very same streets. Just separated by a few decades.
Yeah, it's what got you interested in Jack the Ripper?
To be honest, I wasn't really interested in Jack the Ripper at first because I think I thought what a lot of people think, and that's that it's all about murder, mutilation, which didn't really interest me. But then what I learned was that one of my passions is Charles Dickens and Dickens's London, and I was exploring Dickens's London, and Dickens wrote an awful lot about Whitechapel, and so as you start to delve into Whitechapel, there's no way around it. You come across the Jack the Ripper story, and it suddenly dawned on me that it wasn't just about murder and mayhem and gory stuff. There's a lot of beneath the surface stuff going on as well. There's the social history, there's the newspapers, there's the police coming under constant criticism for various reasons. And it just sort of focuses on this 12 weeks or so in 1888, when the eyes of the world began focusing on a very small part of London. But in so doing, they made that part of London infamous, and it became, as I say, infamous, but also notorious throughout the world. And it was that fascinated me, the way that you've got this story, but just beneath the story, there's thousands and thousands of other stories of everyday lives of people involved in it, police, people who lived in the area, people who were dragged into it. And one thing I'm fascinated by is the number of people who went mad as a result of Jack the Ripper, who were so terrified by what was happening. We have people committing suicide, people being, we have a few people who end up in asylums because they are so scared of Jack the Ripper.
It's crazy, really, when you look back on it, and it's clearly, stood the test of time. Take us back to the mid-19th century. Paint a picture of East End London in those times.
The East End in the 19th century, it wasn't as bad as it's been painted. The East End did have bad bits. It had a lot of it, but it also had some quite well-off bits as well. I think it was Canon Samuel Barnett, who was a local vicar, but he was also a local philanthropist as well, and he ran Toynbee Hall. And at the height of the Ripper scandal, he actually wrote to a newspaper. He said, "Look," he said, "these murders, they are drawing attention to the area, but parts of the East End are far more respectable than the West End, where you've got all this debauchery because of wealth. But here you've got people who are working hard, people who are trying to make ends meet and doing things." So it basically had this reputation for vice and villainy because of a little area around Commercial Street. And that was the area of Flower and Dean Street, Thrall Street, George Street, so it's between Brick Lane and Commercial Street, and that's where you had the common lodging houses, and those streets were known as the blackest of the black streets. And of some of them, the police wouldn't go down them if they were alone. They were so terrified to go down them. So they had this terrible reputation for vice and villainy, and virtually all Jack the Ripper's victims lodged in that area. They came out of that area and were murdered around that area, and that's what started to focus people's attention on it. And the area from quite a few decades before Jack the Ripper had been reported on as an area of ne'er-do-wells, of a criminal underworld that was living around there, and of an uncivilized society. It's interesting to read how people talk about the East End, or the people talked about the East End then, and particularly those parts around Commercial Street, as if we talk about going to the third world today. People actually went on slum tours to go and look at all this, to actually see. It's a bit like a David Attenborough documentary. They'd go and see the poor in their natural habitat. So they go around in omnibuses, and then they'd come back and they'd be able to tell people, "Oh, I saw this. I saw these poor people today." Because of all that, and because the East End, the newspapers were able to report on it, it gave the East End this reputation. And it's almost by design that Jack the Ripper chose that area in which to carry out the murders. And that made the area, in the eyes of Londoners, but in the eyes of the world eventually, it made it an area nothing good can come out of. And Jack the Ripper, in a way, became the personification of all these horrible things that people thought the East End was.
Okay, so tell us who the first victim was, and I've done a little bit of reading on this, but there's something which really surprised me, because I'm a casual observer of Jack the Ripper. I knew who it was, but there's reference to the Canonical Five, but there was apparently people who could have been or were alleged to have been murdered by Jack the Ripper prior to that. So take us through, in order.
Yeah, the big thing about Jack the Ripper is nothing is certain, because we don't know who Jack the Ripper was. Jack the Ripper was never caught, and if we don't know who Jack the Ripper was, we can't say how many victims he had. It's generally agreed there were 5 victims, but the Whitechapel murders file, which has all the murders on it, has 11 victims on it. So the first victim was Emma Elizabeth Smith, who was murdered on Easter Tuesday, 1888. And Emma Smith was, she was probably attacked by a gang. There were gangs in the area, just as there were in Craze Day. There were gangs in the area at the time. And these gangs were criminal gangs. A lot of them ran extortion rackets. And it was quite common for some of the rough gangs of young men to victimize prostitutes and threaten to and attack them and rob them of all their money. And it would seem that Emma Smith was attacked by one of these gangs. We know this because she survived the attack, and she actually went to the hospital where she died in hospital. But before she died, she told the doctor, Dr. Haslip, she'd been attacked by a group of youths, the youngest of which was aged about 18. So she was probably a victim of one of the high rip gangs in the area. Now, it went very quiet after her murder. There was an initial repulsion that somebody could be attacked in such a vicious and horrible way. And it was a vicious attack. There's no doubt about it. But then it went quiet until the 7th of August. And that's when a lady called Martha Tabrum was murdered in George Yard. And that was just off Whitechapel High Street. And she was stabbed 39 times. So her throat wasn't cut and she wasn't disemboweled, but she was stabbed 39 times. A lot of people debate over whether she was the first victim of Jack the Ripper. Many people say she wasn't because the injuries weren't consistent. But some people say, well, Jack the Ripper wouldn't have just come bounding into the East End with his modus operandi intact. So maybe this was a learning curve for him, because whoever committed that murder would have been covered in blood. And that might be why he evolved a method of killing whereby he asphyxiated or strangled his victims first, so the heart would stop beating when he commenced the mutilation, so there wouldn't be arterial spurt or blood spatter that you would get if the heart was still beating. So Martha Tabrum, George Yard, Whitechapel High Street. Then we come to the one that's that we're looking at now, and that's Mary Nichols, and she was murdered on August 31st, 1888. She is generally held to be the first victim of Jack the Ripper. So she's the third Whitechapel murders victim, but she's generally held to be the first victim of Jack the Ripper. And again, she was discovered by a carman on his way to work, a man named Charles Cross. He saw something lying in a gateway. He thought it was a tarpaulin, and he was a carman or a delivery driver by trade. So he thought that might make a useful cover for his wagon. He went to look at it, and he discovered the body of Mary Nichols. Strangely, that's literally just the murder sites behind the Blind Beggar. So you've got and the Grave Maurice as well. So you've got Cray
Which, of course, were notorious Cray pubs, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So you've got 2 of those, and they're literally, if you go past, there's a board school there still. If you go past that, there's a narrow alleyway called Woods Buildings, which you can't get through anymore, but you used to be able to walk through it. And you're out on Whitechapel High Street. To your right is the Grave Maurice. To your left is the Blind Beggar. So your East End territory. So Mary Nichols. Then a week later, you get the murder of Annie Chapman, and that was the 8th of September, 1888. it advanced. Mary Nichols had a throat cut and she was disemboweled as well. Annie Chapman had a throat cut, she was disemboweled, but this time the killer took away a trophy. He went off with a womb. So he cut the womb out and went off with Annie Chapman's womb. And so she was the 8th of September. Then the police increased the presence in the area. They put more police in the area, not so much to try and catch the killer, but there was a lot of anti-Jewish unrest in the area as a result of the murders, because there'd been a great deal of Jewish immigration into the East End in the 1880s. And a lot of people now thought, well, this is a new kind of murder. So, and they did what people always do. They blamed the immigrants. They said, well, it's got to be one of the immigrants. So consequently, the police wanted to contain all this anti-Semitism and stop. One stage there was anti-Jewish rioting in the area. The police tried to contain it, and they did it by flooding police into the area. That seems to have had an effect on the murderer, because then the rest of September went by without any more murders, and people began to calm down. But then on the 30th of September, it's called the night of the double murder. And that's when Elizabeth Stride was murdered in Berner Street, which is off Commercial Road. And Catherine Eddowes was then murdered in Mitre Square. Elizabeth Stride, who we were looking at there, Elizabeth Stride, she's the one on the left. Honest truth is, we don't know for certain, or we don't know whether the photographs of them alive are internet creations. They're not actual photographs of the victims as such. We've got one of Annie Chapman, her wedding photograph, but the other ones are just ones that people have put on the internet and said, oh, that's her. But Elizabeth Stride, you can actually see it in the photograph on the left there. You can see the cut to her throat. She had a throat cut, but she wasn't mutilated. And that led the police to believe that the killer had been interrupted as he went about the killing. He was actually interrupted by a man called Louis Diemschutz, who came into the yard, probably as he was killing Elizabeth Stride, and that meant he didn't commit the mutilations. So the killer then headed to Mitre Square, and it was in Mitre Square he killed Catherine Eddowes. And this is a complete escalation with Catherine Eddowes. He cut the throat, he cut her open, he cut deep V's into the cheeks, deep V's into the eyelids, nicked through the ears, cut off the ears, or cut off one earlobe, or cut through one earlobe. He then plunged his hands in, ripped out the intestines, and went off with the uterus and the left kidney. So he took the kidney away from that body. And then there's a massive gap. The whole of October went by, and there were no further killings. So the whole of October goes by, no murders. What did happen in October significantly, though, is the police released a letter which they'd received at the end of September. And that's the infamous Dear Boss letter. That's
a different one, is it?
Yeah, that's a different one. That's the From Hell letter. So the Dear Boss letter is the one that was signed Jack the Ripper, and it was that signature when that was released that gave him the name. And as a consequence of that name, it really caught on, and it got reported now all over the world. He became known as Jack the Ripper. The letter that you've just shown, the From Hell letter, remember I said that he'd taken the kidney away from Catherine Eddowes' body. Well, as well as the police, you had what were known as Vigilance Patrols in the area. And the president of the Mile End Vigilance Committee was a man called Mr. George Lusk. And he received a letter on the 16th of October, which was addressed from hell. And you can see there, Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half a kidney. Wrapped inside that letter was half a human kidney. And there's a great deal of debate because the letter's suggesting it's the kidney he took from Catherine Eddowes' body. There's a great deal of debate there as to whether or not it was. Some people, in fact, quite a few people now think this is the only genuine letter that was sent. We've mentioned two, but there were thousands of letters being sent at the time. Many signed Jack the Ripper. Everybody wanted to send Jack the Ripper letters. This is one of the very few that people think actually did come from the killer. Even the Dear Boss letter probably didn't come from the killer. So that's all going on in October. So it keeps the story going throughout October. But
I've got the other letter for you, Richard. So that's the Dear Boss letter.
The Dear Boss letter. That's the one. Yeah, Dear Boss, keep on hearing the police have caught me, and it goes on. And then on the side of it, or the other side, there's the signature Jack the Ripper, and so basically this is what's happening. November comes in. People are starting to calm down again. And then on the 9th of November, Mary Kelly was murdered in her room. And she was murdered indoors. She's the only one who was murdered indoors, 13 Miller's Court. and her throat was cut. She'd been stabbed, but she was completely torn apart. The body was quite literally skinned down to the bone. And that photograph that's the only one of the victims that was photographed at the scene of the crime. It's believed to be one of the very earliest, if not the earliest, crime scene photograph of a murder victim. And
that's horrific, Richard. That really is horrific.
It's horrible.
Isn't it?
I mean, it is terrible. I mean, and you get the idea. You really see what was going on, why this had such an impact on people. But she's believed to have been the last victim of Jack the Ripper. And then you get several more Whitechapel murders. You get Rose Mylett is murdered in December 1888, Alice Mackenzie in July 1889. Someone who was never identified, but is just known as the Pinchin Street torso in September 1889, was found under a railway arch in Pinchin Street. Again, just a few streets from Berners Street, where Elizabeth Stride was murdered. And then 13th of February 1891, the murder of Frances Coles. And she's the last name on the Whitechapel murders file. People don't tend to think that those last ones, the ones after Mary Kelly, were Jack the Ripper victims. As I say, though, we can't be certain because we don't know who Jack the Ripper is. And in a nutshell, that's the Jack the Ripper story.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing story, and it's something which obviously, as I say, has deep fascination with people. And I think a lot of the fascination is simply down to the fact that, as you say, he's never really been identified. So who was in the frame, Richard, for being the Ripper?
At the time, everybody and nobody. The police were arresting people on an almost weekly basis. Very early on in the investigation, just after the murder of Mary Nichols, it's found that, or the press found out, the police were looking for a character called Leather Apron, who apparently had been threatening prostitutes around Brick Lane, Thrall Street, Commercial Street. And one of the police officers, the wonderfully named Sergeant William Thick, said, "Well, I know who Leather Apron is. It's John Pizer." So eventually they arrested John Pizer 2 days after the murder of Annie Chapman. He had cast iron alibis for the nights of the two most recent murders, so he was quickly ruled out as a suspect. But then they were pulling people in almost daily. A lot of people were saying, yeah, I know it is. It's him down the road. So the police, we'll get him, pull him in. They were able to account for themselves. So it's true to say at the time the police had suspects. They had people they arrested, but every time they arrested them, a very promising one was a chap called Charles Ludwig, or Ludwig to give him. He was arrested in September 1888. What had happened was that a policeman was on his patrol down Minories, which is the street that goes from Aldgate down to the Tower of London. And he was passing a notorious court. It's a dark court that led to some railway arches. And he heard a scream. So he ran down into the railway arches and he found a man and a woman standing there. The woman was obviously a prostitute. And the woman said, "Oh, policeman, do take me out of this." So the policeman said to the man, "What are you doing?" He said, "Nothing." He said, so he sent the man on his way. And the woman said, she said, and she couldn't speak. She was so terrified. So he escorted her down the street and they got back to Aldgate High Street. And she said to the policeman, "Oh, he did give me such a scare when he pulled out that big knife." And of course, he'd sent him on his way. So his jaw must have hit the floor because he thought he'd had the killer and let him go. As it turned out, the man went down to a coffee stall on Whitechapel High Street. And he tried to attack a young man with his knife, and he was arrested. As it turned out, it was a German called Charles Ludwig, and he seemed a very promising suspect. But he was in police custody when the 30th of September happened and the night of the double murder. So effectively, he was ruled out as a result of that. So this kept happening. They kept pulling people. We know they had suspects. The problem is that we don't have the evidence anymore. The files have gone missing. We don't have the files. They've either been destroyed or gone missing. So we don't know who they suspected at the time. But it's since then that lots of suspects have come forward. One that has come forward that seems to have been the police's favoured suspect was a man called Aaron Kozminski. Now, Kozminski was the favoured suspect of Dr. Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson was the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, and he was also the head of the Criminal Investigation Department, the CID. And in his memoirs, he said that, effectively he said that we knew who Jack the Ripper was. He says undiscovered murders are rare in London, and the crimes known as the Jack the Ripper murders do not fall into that category. And then he goes on to say that it was a low-born Polish Jew living in the heart of the area. And he also says that when the one person who ever got a good view of the face of the murderer was confronted with our suspect, he unhesitatingly identified the suspect as the man he'd seen. So Anderson doesn't name him. He just says he was a Polish Jew, and there was a witness identification. Now, a copy of Anderson's memoirs went to Chief Inspector Swanson, who was the man in early September. He was given the job of assessing all the information on the case. Every bit of information went through Donald Sutherland Swanson. So he had the big picture. And his copy of Anderson's memoirs came back into the public domain in 1988. And in the margin of the book, he has scrawled the name Kozminski. And he says there was a witness identification, but he says the witness wouldn't testify because the witness was Jewish and he wouldn't testify against one of his own kind. So the police then released the suspect into the care of his brother, kept him under surveillance, and shortly after he goes to the County Lunatic Asylum at Colney Hatch. And there's only one Kozminski in the asylum records who fits that bill, and this is Aaron Kozminski. He was certainly in the area at the time. He was the leading suspect of the two highest ranking officers, Swanson and Anderson, or we think he was anyway. So consequently, he would seem to be the really up there on the list of who Jack the Ripper was. The problem for us, as I've said before, is the evidence has disappeared. So we haven't got their evidence, and without it, we can't say for certain that he was Jack the Ripper.
History obviously tends to paint things in a different picture, and the thing that I often remember being pointed in the direction of was that the victims were all prostitutes. Is that true?
It's a can of worms today. There's a book that's come out called The Five, which says that it's misogynistic to say they were all prostitutes. They weren't. They were sleeping. They were women who were working hard. It's all the evidence suggests they were. Now, by prostitutes, that they weren't prostitutes in the sense that they weren't sex workers. They were women who were living on the breadline, and they did what they had to do to survive. Mary Nichols, for example, the first victim, she needed 4pence to pay for a bed in a lodging house. She didn't have it, so she was evicted from the lodging house around about midnight on the 31st of or 30th to the 31st of August. She had a bonnet, and she obviously she said to the lodging house keeper as she left, "I'll still get the DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I'm wearing." Now, why would she think the bonnet would get her some DOS money? She obviously thought it would be an irresistible allure. And we do know that she met with a friend of hers at 2:30 in the morning on the 31st, a lady called Emily Holland. And she boasted to her she'd made the lodging money several times over, but had spent it on drink. And she was now going to go out and make it one last time. Now, that's there emphatically that she was going to make money at 2:30 in the morning. It's there in Emily Holland's inquest statements. How was she going to make money at 2:30 in the morning? How had she made the money? They were probably casual prostitutes. And personally, I don't like the term prostitute to describe them because they were surviving. They were survivors. And I much prefer the Victorian term for them, which was unfortunates. And I think that really does sum up the fact that they'd fallen through the net. There was nothing there to catch them. But there's a huge amount of debate now saying that, oh, no, they weren't prostitutes, and it's misogynistic to say that they were. But I have to say, the evidence all suggests, reading the evidence suggests that they were. And the other thing about it, of course, is that they were trying to survive. So to actually say, well, yeah, they were just sleeping, I think that does them a disservice as well. I really think it does no favors to their memory. And the other thing, of course, is that it focuses on the 5 victims. That thinking does. There's 11 victims on the murders file. So what they're saying there is, well, if you weren't murdered by Jack the Ripper, your death doesn't count. So it's just one of those things that I just find there's a great tendency to do this today, and that's rewriting history. History is there; it's there to be read. The problem is that people don't read history; they read assessments of history, And so whoever's assessing the history is the one they believe. And nowadays, there's no grey area anymore. There's either you're on this side, or you're on this side. There's no, well, sort of in between.
Royal scandal is something that we've become accustomed to. There is two royal links that I managed to find. Obviously, the most obvious one is Prince Albert, known to Eddie as his friends. Suggestions that he could have been the Ripper. I found that fascinating.
That's been around. Eddie's been in the frame since the 1960s. It was a criminologist called Thomas Stowell who was told. I think he told Colin Wilson that basically there's two stories to do with Eddie. Either he's the murderer himself. That's one of the stories. The other story is that he married a Catholic girl called Annie Elizabeth Crook. He'd had a child by her, and then the child had been. The family had been broken up. This is the subject of the Michael Caine film, and it's the subject of the From Hell film with Johnny Depp. That the child had then been taken away. Annie Crook had been put into an asylum, so the authorities had put her into an asylum to stop her telling what she knew. But the child was smuggled to safety by the servant girl, who then went into the East End and fell in with a gaggle of drunken prostitutes, told them what she knew, and they set about blackmailing the royal family. So the Freemasons were sent out to break the fact to silence them, and of course the servant girl was Mary Kelly, and she was the last victim of Jack the Ripper. So when she dies, there's no need for any further murders because it's been solved. Eddie, it's an interesting theory. I mean, Stephen King's book on it, The Final Solution, is the best-selling book that's ever been on Jack the Ripper. A massive seller. Whether it's true or not is another matter altogether. I can't say 100% that it's not, because, as I say, we don't know who Jack the Ripper was, so it's impossible to say whether it's true. We know where Eddie was on the nights of the murders, and he certainly wasn't in London on the nights of the murders. He was Balmoral, Sandringham. He was all over the place, but he wasn't in London on the nights of the murders. As for the Masonic theory, it's a great theory. People love conspiracy theories. Personally, I don't hold with it. I don't think it was. But again, as I say, I can't say for certain, and I can't say that theory is nonsense, because other people might say, well, anyone's theory is nonsense.
I guess, he's out of the frame by the sounds of it. The other potential royal connection was Sir John Williams, who was Queen Victoria's surgeon. How did he get his name put in the frame? And this was a story in the Daily Mail.
Yeah, he got his name put into the frame by one of his descendants, who it's amazing how many people want to claim that their great-great-great-grandfather or someone in their past was Jack the Ripper. It's amazing how many people want to claim the man. I mean, personally, I think I wouldn't want anyone to know that I was descended from Jack the Ripper. But yeah, but he got basically he was a fertility. He was looking into fertility. And that's. The theory is that's why he took the wombs out of the victims, out of Annie Chapman and Kate Eddowes, because he wanted wombs to experiment on. Again, I don't hold. The evidence just isn't there to say that it was him, but the evidence isn't there against anybody.
Yeah, it's just amazing that the names that get connected, and I guess the various jobs or titles that these people actually had. And another one is Montague Druitt, is it the pronunciation?
Montague John Druitt, yeah.
Yeah, another person who I believe he was an English barrister. And I think that the reason he seemed to get blamed was that the murders came to an end when he killed himself.
Yeah, he is an interesting one. He probably, until Kozminski's name became known, he probably was one of the leading suspect for being Jack the Ripper. Druitt actually appears. There's a thing called the McNaughton Memoranda that was done in 1894 by Chief Constable. Well, he was the Assistant Chief Constable of Scotland Yard, Melvin McNaughton. He joined as Assistant Chief Constable in June 1889. Now, in 1894, the Sun newspaper ran a series of articles in February saying they knew who Jack the Ripper was, and they'd been to see him in Broadmoor Asylum, and they did I think it was from the 14th through to the 17th. They did up these articles every day. And they didn't name him, but it's obvious they're suggesting that it was a man called Thomas Cutbush. And Thomas Cutbush had been in the asylum since, I think, 1891. Thomas Cutbush was the nephew of Superintendent Cutbush at Scotland Yard. And the son now, although they're not naming him, everything they're saying is pointing to this Thomas Cutbush. Melville Macnaghten, therefore, compiled a memorandum saying the story's nonsense. Cutbush wasn't Jack the Ripper. And in that memorandum, he says, and I can give the names of 3 men, any one of whom, and this is the important thing he says. He doesn't say they were suspects. He said, I can give the names of 3 men, any one of whom is more likely than Cutbush to have been the killer. And those 3 men were Kozminski, Michael Osdrog, and the other one was M.J. Druitt. Now, he actually says in the memorandum that M.J. Druitt was a doctor, but he wasn't. He was a barrister. But he was also moonlighting or working as a teacher as well at a place called Valentine's School down at Blackheath, London. Now, Montague John Druitt, in the memorandum, Macnaghten says that from private information, he believes that his own family thought he was the Ripper. So he was obviously Macnaghten's favoured suspect. And the thing about Druitt is he committed suicide at the end of 1888. His body washed up on the Thames at Chiswick on the last day of the year. And he left a note behind saying he felt he was going mad, he couldn't, and it was better he should die. Now, what's interesting about Druitt is that he's convenient. We do know that the police probably had started to think something had happened to the killer after the murder of Mary Nichols. So they were starting to ask the question, what's happened to him? Why have the murders stopped? Why aren't we getting any more murders? And they were probably combing through asylum records to see if he'd gone into an asylum, and also through suicide records as well. Macnaghten actually says that it's obvious after such a horrible killing as that of Mary Kelly, the killer's mind must have given way. And Druitt fits nicely into that. So his name. Again, there's little... the facts contradict the theory about him. Macnaghten says his mind gave way after the murder in Miller's Court. It didn't. We know he was actually appearing in court. He was conducting cases in court after the murder of Mary Kelly. At the end of November, he was dismissed from the school he was working at, and it was just after that he committed suicide. So it would appear that it was something to do with his dismissal from the school that led to his suicide, not with him being Jack the Ripper and his mind giving way. Again, problem is we don't know what that something was, what happened. We don't know why he was dismissed. We can guess, but as I say, we don't know. And it ruined. So he just went and committed suicide. But there's all sorts of theory reading into Montague John Druitt, and he is a fascinating one. And as I say, up until Kozminski's name becoming well known and wide circulation, Druitt was probably at the top of the list for having been Jack the Ripper.
I guess with Cutbush, I mean, he had committed an act of violence, hadn't he? He'd stabbed somebody, but he'd also been committed to Lambeth, I think, and then was eventually committed to Broadmoor, where he passed away. But I mean, with Cutbush, again, it just seems as if you're dipping your hand into the into a box and picking out a name at random. There's so many potential people who could have been the Ripper.
Yeah, I mean, Cutbush is interesting because Cutbush. His asylum records, under the 100-year rule, his asylum records became available in, I think it was 2008. And if you read his asylum records, he is, funnily enough, Kozminski, and as far as we know, wasn't homicidal in the asylum. The only record of violence we have on Kozminski is he threw a chair in an attendant. That's about it for Kozminski's violence. Cutbush is homicidal. He's threatening to rip people apart when he's in the asylum. He wants to kill people. One occasion, his mother goes to bid him good night or goodbye, stoops over to kiss him, and he tries to bite her nose off. I mean, so Cutbush is someone who he doesn't get too much of a look in, really. I think he's someone who's be quite interesting to investigate a lot further. But he was stabbing young girls. When I say stabbing them, he would sort of walk up behind them and just jab them with a knife, or at least that's what he was accused of. His solicitor and his family maintained that it was mistaken identity, that he hadn't done it, and that he had alibis on the nights, certainly on one of the nights when it happened. But as I say, we'll never know now.
The police got a bit of a raw deal from the press, and I mean, I put this cartoon up a little bit earlier, but I mean, the cartoon of the policeman being blindfolded just, I guess, sums up the fact that we had all of these potential criminals who were being linked with the crime, but no actual conviction. And I think there was actually a vigilante committee set up at one point in Whitechapel because business owners were so sick and tired of the fact that the police just hadn't caught this person.
Yeah. It was vigilance. In fact, there were quite a few of the vigilance committees were set up. The first one was the Toynbee Hall Vigilance Committee, which was set up round about in early September. So it was set up from Toynbee Hall, and then there were a few others, but the most famous one was the Mile End Vigilance Committee, which is also referred to as the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee as well. That's the one Mr. George Lusk was the chairman of. The Vigilance Committee. What they set themselves up for was to actually supplement the police numbers. So they went out at night and they would patrol the streets and they would report suspicious characters to the police. The problem was you had so many people out there trying to catch the Whitechapel murderer that it was causing problems in their own right, because they'd follow each other. They'd be in disguise. So they'd be disguising as locals walking around. And another member of another vigilance committee might see them and think, oh, he looks suspicious. So they'd start following him. And then they'd find out they'd followed, that they were both vigilance committees. Policemen would then follow people and arrest people and then find out they're members of the vigilance committees. You had newspaper journalists in the area dressed up in costumes, some of them even dressed as women, to try and tempt Jack the Ripper to approach them. So you had, the police, though, came under massive real huge criticism, largely because of their commissioner, Sir Charles Warren. He was very, very unpopular with the newspapers, with the radical newspapers at least, because of an event that had happened two events the previous year. One was the case of Miss Cass, who was a young girl who'd gone out to Regent Street on Jubilee night 1887 to buy a pair of gloves, and she was arrested by PC Endicott for being a prostitute. And she went, and he took her into. She said, "I haven't done anything." He said, "I saw you. You were soliciting men." And he took her to the police station, and she appeared in court the next day before Mr. Newton. Now there wasn't enough evidence, so Mr. Newton, the magistrate, dismissed her. But he said to her, "If you are a respectable woman, you will not be seen out on Regent Street at 10 o'clock at night." And the Liberal press and members of Parliament went ballistic over this. They said, "So you're saying that any woman who goes out on her own on Regent Street is a prostitute?" And it caused a huge furore. Sir Charles Warren then investigated it. He said, "Oh, I'm going to call an investigation," because he was the police commissioner. But he acted as judge and jury in his own investigation, and that made him very unpopular with the newspapers. And then on Sunday, the 13th of November, 1887. There'd been a protest in Trafalgar Square. Contrary, Sir Charles Warren had banned protests, and he actually sent the police in to clear the square, and police on horseback went in, and it was carnage. It was an awful day, but it went down. It's still to this day known as Bloody Sunday, and that turned a lot of the radical newspapers against Sir Charles Warren. So by 1888. The press were desperate to have it's a bit like Cressida Dick at the moment. The press are desperate to have a dig at Cressida Dick. And same with Sir Charles Warren. The press were just out to get him. And consequently, when the Jack the Ripper murders came along, it gave the press the perfect opportunity. So he and the Metropolitan Police got a really bad press. And they didn't help themselves because they refused to share anything with the newspapers. So the newspapers couldn't get any information out of the police. And so consequently, they sort of made things up and they kept attacking the police, saying, well, if the police can't do it, they're incompetent. And that's basically all that stuff like the Punch cartoon showing the blindfolded police officer.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to go back through the records and just look at how the media operated in those days compared to now. And I've got to say, it's not much different. The cartoons are certainly very damning. And obviously the one I showed slightly earlier there, which was entitled "The Nemesis of Neglect," which was in Punch, was it magazine? Yeah, Punch cartoon, 1888. Again, it just sums up the time, the feeling, and very Dickensian, as you say, which is what attracted you to this particular story.
Yeah, yeah, and that image you got there, that's the Nemesis and Neglect was the one that, funnily enough, that was drawn by I've just forgotten his name, but he was the same illustrator who illustrated Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, and he's the same illustrator, and it was it really did sum up. It's called there floats a phantom on the nighttime air, and it talks about this. It's basically saying that what the murders have come out because society's allowed the murder to develop. Everybody, a lot of people came to think that Jack the Ripper was something that was born from the slums because we'd let the slums develop so badly. We'd let people just grow up in squalor and without any civilizing factors. And so the belief was that this had then led to something coming out of those slums. And that's something, as in that cartoon, was the Nemesis and Neglect. That's the phantom floating on the miasmic air of London.
So your interest came from obviously from the the Dickensian stuff, the Charles Dickens stuff, and yeah, I mean, tell us why you decided to write your first book, and what was your first book?
My very first book, funny enough, was a book on. It was done for a company in America called Frommers, and it was 12 walking tours around London. One of which was the East End of London, and then my next book was Walking Haunted London, which sold really well. That was 1997, and that sold really well. And then the publishers then commissioned me to do a series of ghost books: Haunted Britain and Ireland, Haunted Castles, Haunted Inns. And they sold. Haunted Britain sold fantastically well, and the publishers then said, "Oh, what would you like to write about?" And so I said, I'd really love to do a book on Dickens. So I did a book called Walking Dickensian London. And then they came to me after that and they said, would you like to do one on Jack the Ripper? And I said, oh, would I like to do one on Jack the Ripper? So I said, yeah. So I did Uncovering Jack the Ripper's London in 2000. Well, I wrote it in 2005. And it was good because it gave me the opportunity to do something I'd always wanted to do. And that was write a book that concentrated on the area. On the story, not on who it was. I've never been really interested in solving the mystery, but on what the crimes exposed, what insight it gives us into the area. So that was Uncovering, and then Carlton approached me, I think 2 years later, and asked me if I'd do that Jack the Ripper the case book, and that was nice because they had deep pockets, so they were able to get copies of all the documents. The letter, the police files, and there's little inserts in that book where you can actually take out the documents and read some of the police reports from the era and stuff like that. So that was nice to write.
Yeah, fantastic, and that's it. You get embroiled in the story, I guess. And going out and walking the streets of London now isn't quite the same, but I guess there are some places where you can go which are still the same. Tell us a little bit about the streets of Whitechapel.
Yeah, there's something to say. I mean, that's what the Edgar Guide is all about, because with Edgar, myself and my co-author, Adam Wood, we felt that, everybody knows the little area around Commercial Street. And constantly, one of the things you get with the tours, because I do the Jack the Ripper tours as well, and you get people come back who say, I often read on things that say, well, there's no point doing it because nothing survives. And you think, well, it does. You just have to look for it. It's there if you look for it. So with this book, the first place we go to is Gunthorpe Street, which was called George Yard in 1888. And there's a pub on the corner called the White Hart, and then you go through this arch, and it's a cobblestone thoroughfare. And as you go into that arch, especially at night, you feel the 21st century slip away, and it's as though you're literally you've gone through a time portal. You've slipped back, and suddenly there's a building on your left that still was built in 1886, and that's up there on your left. And then we go to, for example, it takes you then down Brick Lane, and there's places like there's a drinking fountain that was put there in 1860, so that would have been there at the time. There's a pub on the corner of Thrall Street called it's an Indian restaurant. But if you look up, you'll see it's got two cross frying pans above it. It's the frying pan. That's the pub Mary Nichols was drinking in on the night she was murdered. It's not a pub anymore, and if it's not pointed out to you, you wouldn't see the two frying pans up on top because you just think, oh, it's an Indian restaurant. And then you go, and then you've got a whole little knot of streets after that: Fournier Street, Princeton Street, Wilkes Street, and they are lined by houses that are exactly as they were in 1888. And then in the Edgar Guide, there was a discovery for me that I did next. We went down. You go down Hanbury Street, and there's a modern block of council flats as you get towards Spelman Street, just off Hanbury Street. But behind that block of flats, I suddenly discovered there was it's called Albert and Victoria Cottages, and they were built in the 1860s. And it's like this, they're just tiny little cottages, but there's a whole 2 rows of them going right down that have survived. And they're just surrounded by modern council estates. You wouldn't even, I've been doing walks around there since 1982. And until lockdown, I didn't even know those cottages were there. I must have seen them, but it just hadn't, maybe it hadn't sunk in. And they're amazing to discover. And then you go further down, you've got Mary Nichols murder site, which, strangely enough, Mary Nichols murder site now, it's been a building site for the last 5 years, but they've opened an exit from Whitechapel Station, which comes straight out onto the site. So people coming out of the station are stepping straight over the place where Mary Nichols' body was found. And but next to that is the board school, which was there in 1880. It's the one building in the area that has survived, or in that vicinity that survived, and it looked down on the site of the murder. It's now flats, but it was a board school, and that's looking down on you. Then you've got the London Hospital, that's survived. And then if you then go over to Berners Street, one of the murders I mentioned earlier was the Pinchin Street torso murder, and the arch where the torso was found, that's still there, and that's still quite creepy. And then just beyond it is St. George's Churchyard, where you've got the mortuary the Pinchin Street torso was taken to that mortuary, but also the body of Elizabeth Stride was taken to that mortuary as well. And it's a rundown building. It looks like a tumble down shed in the churchyard, but it's actually the mortuary to which the two of the victims were taken. That's there in the yard. And then you come back towards the city, and you've got, Mitre Square has now been redeveloped, but you've still got, for example, in Goulston Street, you've still got the doorway where the chalked message was found on the wall: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." And that's now, it's now the wall of a restaurant, a fish and chip shop actually, or fish and chip restaurant. But the wall's still there, and they've got all these plans. So there's a lot of it still there. And and I always say, I think we say it at the end of Edgar, that there is a lot there. You just have to know where to look.
Are you surprised at people's fascination with this? Because I presume your tours are fully booked. I know, the similar tours in London for the Craze and Gangland tours, etc. And are you surprised at people's fascination?
I am, and I'm not. I mean, it does surprise me, because it's something that people just become more and more fascinated in. It never seems to. People just, I don't know what it is about it. There's some. It just fascinates people. And so as I say, I've been doing it since 1982, and I've seen the ups and downs. Funnily enough, when I started, it wasn't that popular. It was popular, but it wasn't that popular. It really took off in the centenary year when the Michael Caine film came out, and then suddenly it just went from, I might take 30 round a night, and suddenly I was getting 200, 300 people a night were turning up for it, and it's so that was a surprise. But I always say I can't knock it. Jack the Ripper bought my house.
2015, I think it was. There was actually a museum opened specifically about Jack the Ripper in the East End, and I mean that in itself tells you, how popular he is as a figure, as somebody, somebody attracts people to a museum. I mean, what's the museum like? I've not been to it yet. I must go to it.
Yeah, I've got to confess, I've not been to it either. I've heard mixed views on it. Some people say, well, it's it's not very big. It's in Cable Street. It's at the top of Cable Street. It's quite. I mean, the buildings, they're nice old buildings around there. But so I can't. I mean, I've heard mixed people have mixed feelings about it. It's got no direct connection to Jack the Ripper in there. But as I say, it's subjective. Some people love it. Some people. Personally, my preference is, if I'm going to look at the stuff, I want to look at the documents. Go to the archives at Kew, and look for the files, which you can do. Anybody can do it. Go through the newspaper archives and just read the reports, and some of the reports are so evocative. It's as though you're there. You're it's like the rolling Sky News today. You think, oh, I'm there. I can just sense the fear, because the journalists were all in the area interviewing people, saying, oh, and they were standing with the crowds in the middle of the night as they are panicking. They're going, oh, and they're out interviewing people. They're talking to women and going, well, what do you think? You could be murdered by Jack the Ripper. And the women are saying, well, to be honest, it's the Ripper or the river for me. And so let him come, I'll take it. And it's amazing. You're hearing the voices, and that's the incredible thing.
Yeah, of course it is. It's fascinating. I think there's nothing that grips the public's imagination more, and because it's an unknown man, we don't know exactly who it was. That is probably the biggest attraction of it all, and probably why there's always so much speculation and new stories coming out time and time again, and subsequently, Jack the Chipper fish shops opened up, which was slightly bad taste, I think, in Greenwich. I think there was a lot of bad publicity and a few protests about that.
There's actually one in Whitechapel.
Yeah.
So it's still
going.
Yeah. The one that's got all the publicity is the Greenwich one. But there is one on the corner of Osborne Street, just literally on Whitechapel High Street. They went the first. The first one was Jack the Clipper Barber shop. And that's their site. Their motto is London born and bled.
Is there anything? Obviously they have their own museum. You haven't been to that, but say the Scotland Yard, the infamous Black Museum. Is there anything left from the case apart from the letters?
They've got stuff like they've got photographs and one of the. They don't tend to concentrate that much on Jack the Ripper anymore. The Scotland, that's actually closed at the moment. It's all in storage because the Met, they moved from the Victoria HQ back down to the Embankment, so they're down the Embankment. What one place has a little bit on it is the City of London Police Museum. Because the City of London is a separate police from the Metropolitan Police, and they have their own museum, which is in Guildhall. And they've got a little. Catherine Eddowes, the fourth victim, was murdered in Mitre Square, which is in the City of London. So the City Police investigated her murder, not the Metropolitan Police. So there's an exhibit of hers and some of the letters were sent to the City Police Commissioner, so they're on display in there as well. So that's quite a nice one. Of course, the London Dungeon was the first one. They've got the big Jack the Ripper exhibit, which shows the street. You can walk through Hanbury Street to see the murders. That's good. It's nicely done. It's well done there. Yeah, it's London Dungeon. They know their target market and go straight for the jugular. In this case, quite literally, but it's.
With the advances of science and technology, with some of the stuff, the letters, perhaps, is, of the envelopes that remain, is there any way that DNA could have been obtained and you could have found out who the Ripper was?
Well, that's an interesting, because that's exactly what Patricia Cornwell did when she did her book on Walter Sickert being Jack the Ripper. She started paying for DNA and stuff off the letters. The problem is that the murderer. And again, this is where it gets so confusing, because Jack the Ripper was not the Whitechapel murderer. Jack the Ripper was the name given to the signature of the letter. So consequently, technically speaking, Jack the Ripper never existed. It was the Whitechapel murderer. And when that first letter signed Jack the Ripper came in, by October, the police had got over 1,000 letters, many of them signed Jack the Ripper. So what Patricia Cornwell did was, yes, I'm going to do DNA analysis. We'll do DNA on there. Problem with doing DNA is time has passed, so the DNA will have degraded. Secondly, the letters have been handled by so many people. Over the years, they've been handled by so many different people that, again, it's going to have degraded the DNA. And thirdly, even if we do get a piece of DNA and say, we simply knew who wrote a letter, we wouldn't know who Jack the Ripper was or who the murderer was, because they were probably completely different people.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, of course, decades later, we have, a copycat. We have Peter Sutcliffe, who was eventually charged and found guilty of being the Yorkshire Ripper. And almost eerily, George Humble, years later, was convicted, of course, of a letter, which, again, it's just that coincidence, or was it his idea of a prank that went wrong? But it was very similar, wasn't it? And the tape, we had that extra bit of technology then. We had a tape recording. And I remember I was a young kid growing up. I'm Jack. And this is when your fascination really had started, and you were getting right into it. I mean, did you look at that in amazement at the time?
No, funnily enough, because I initially I come from Stoke-on-Trent, so I'm from the Midlands. And I can remember that the Yorkshire Ripper period. My sister was up in, she was a nurse at the time, or she was training as a nurse at the time, but she was up in Manchester. And I can remember the terror that she said going out on, that she wouldn't go out. People were, going past the people were terrified to go out. I can remember watching on TV, and everyone was like, streets were like ghost towns. People wouldn't go out on the streets. And the I'm Jack, the tape, I can remember I'd come down when he was caught. I'd come down to London, and I was working in an office in London, and I can remember. And again, it just shows you can actually see the main mentality behind this. Actually, behind the letter writers from that is that I think I can't remember who did it. I think maybe it was the police. They put the letter, did the recording, and you could phone the hotline and listen to the voice.
That's right.
And again, I'm Jack, and I can remember the guys in the office would they dial the number and then transfer the call to one of the secretaries. So she said, "I've got a call for you," and then she picked the phone up again, and they'd hear, "I'm Jack." It's almost like it was a joke, just like the Jack the Ripper letters were again. It'd be, as I say, I don't know if it's how people react or whatever, but it was very, 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 it was a bizarre period. And of course, then it turned out that was the red herring. It had thrown the police off on completely the wrong trail. And it's probably the same with the letter as well. But the letter probably sent the police or gave the public, in the public's mind, gave us the impression that Jack the Ripper was educated when he probably wasn't. He was probably someone living in the area. But it's that red herring. You've got the police red herring, and it just goes. The investigation just goes the wrong way. And of course, Peter Sutcliffe was caught not with all the detective work, a good old-fashioned police gut instinct.
Yeah, and just a little side note to that, for those of you who are watching my podcast for the first time, I actually had an encounter with Peter Sutcliffe myself, but it was in Broadmoor on a visit to Ronnie Cray. Yes, he actually knocked me chair on a visit when I was visiting Ronnie Cray in Broadmoor, and he walked in and clipped the back of my chair. I turned round to see who it was, and when I turned back, Ronnie Cray was going red in the face and seething with anger that he hadn't apologised and had to be calmed down on the actual visit. So quite a fascinating story, that. But yeah, I did see Sutcliffe again on another visit, but he wasn't sitting anywhere near us at Ron's instruction. But very, very instantly recognisable, jet black hair at the time, very vacant look, and very little conversation with a woman who was visiting from South Shields, similar area to me, only 10 miles away from where I live. So yes, my encounter with Peter Sutcliffe was brief, and I'm lucky to say that I survived to tell the tale, Richard.
Yeah.
So before we finish and give your books a last plug, I guess the $1 million question is, who does Richard Jones think was Jack the Ripper?
My honest answer would have to be, I haven't got the foggiest idea, but I fall down on. There's two I would say. I think the likeliest one of them all is Kozminski. Of all the names of put forward, I think Kozminski has to be he was the favoured suspect of the two highest ranking officers on the case. They knew all the evidence, and if they thought the evidence against him was better than the evidence against any other suspect, he's got to be up there on the list of suspects. Only problem, as I say, is unless I can see the evidence, I can't say 100% that it was. But I think Kozminski probably. But I'm still of the opinion that Cutbush should be looked into a lot more. I think Cutbush is neglected. and Thomas Cutbush is worth exploring, because I think there might be stuff there. There might not. It might just all fall down. But he doesn't tend to get a look in. But I think of them all. Yeah, they're the two. But then again, I also have the belief that it could be just a nobody who lived in the area. It's somebody who everybody looked at and thought, someone like Sutcliffe, who's just so ordinary. And when he's brought to justice, if he had been brought to justice, probably everyone would go, no. He was very quiet, but he was just one of us. Because that's the danger of these people. They are just one of us. And that's why people aren't threatened by them. And if you think about it, the victims weren't threatened by him either, because they went with him to those dark corners of dark places where they knew they couldn't be protected. So he wouldn't have been an absolute nutter, madman. He would have been, in some ways, somebody who went with them and then committed the murders. And by the time they realised what he was, it was too late.
Very true. Yeah, it made me remember that infamous front page of the Sun when Fred West was arrested. Standing in his cellar with his hard hat on and his hammer. And I think his neighbour had said, I always used to go next door to have a cup of tea. He was a lovely fella. But it's exactly the same. Fred West was, a serial killer. And, he's the most unlikely person at that time to be thought of. So, yeah, you're right. Great stuff. I could talk to you all night, Richard, and I'm certainly going to book up on your show, your walk, on your walk around. I think that would be great to come down. Jamie recommends it, so I will certainly do that. You've got a lot of books available on Amazon, so if people just go onto Amazon and look for Richard Jones's name, you will be able to find them on there. I will put a couple of links down in the description box. This is the most recent one, Edgar's Walking Guides, Jack the Ripper's East End, with Richard Jones and Adam Wood. Absolutely fascinating speaking to you.
Lovely to talk to you.
Looking forward to meeting you in the future, and best of luck with everything you do. Take care, Richard.
And with you as well. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Bye-bye.